You are listening to Charlotte Real Estate Talk with Pridemore Properties.
Hello, Scott Pridemore and Mike Hagee with Pridemore Properties for another episode of Charlotte Real Estate Talk. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we welcome Cynthia Jones with Horack, Talley, Community Associations and HOA Law. Thank you so much for joining us, Cynthia.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here. And we know that there's a lot of buzz around maintaining your property, right? And making sure that it's up to par with standards of the community. And we talk about HOA bylaws and covenant restrictions and all those things related to HOA law and that centers. And, what have you seen I'm just curious, the biggest dispute between homeowners and HOAs? Have there Obviously, sometimes that can set the tone for the beginning of a good relationship or maybe the opposite.
That's true. It can be very good from the outside or very bad. But a very common issue we see in the office is whether or not someone's maintaining their property the way either the board or the management company thinks they should be. So we see a lot of violation letters for there's too many weeds in your yard, or you need to cut your grass, or you need to trim your bushes. It's very, very common. Now, keep in mind, I don't see the good in my office, so I only ever see the bad. But that is a big issue because, your home is one of your largest expenses. And a lot of people, if you're going to sell the house, they want to show the house. And if the neighbor's yard looks bad, then
Sure.
It hurts them a little bit. So it's something that it's the first thing you see when you drive into a community. If there's lots of weeds and unmowed yards at the front entrance, no one's going to want to come in and buy a house. So it's very important.
Absolutely. So whether someone is in a community with a homeowners association or not, knowing what to look out for if you are within a community is important. And for those that are not, that may invest in properties that are within HOAs, it's a good idea to get a sense of what the rules of the game are, so to speak. So what would you say the most frequent complaint is? Is it around maintenance, around I'm blanking. What is the most common complaint with respect to either homeowners or HOA managers?
It's usually maintenance. Someone thinks that the property is either not being maintained correctly by the owner, or someone thinks the association should be doing something either on their property or in the common area that they're not. So we hear that a lot. That's the big one.
You've been a speaker at a number of legal workshops like Community Association Institute Law Day. Tell us a little bit more about that.
I love Community Association Institute. I speak with them as often as I can. They're pretty much our trade organization for community associations. I attend their national law conference every year. And, there are hundreds of attorneys across the United States that go to that conference. And it gives us a chance to talk about what are the topics and the hot issues that everyone's seeing. On a national level, that helps us in our practice. But on a local level, being a member of both the North Carolina and the South Carolina chapters, it gives me the opportunity to educate both board members and property managers about what they need to be aware of in their industry, cautions they should take, hot topics and tips they should do, because I feel very strongly that the more educated my clients are, the less problems they'll have, and the easier my job is and the easier their job is. So I do a lot of that as much as I can, but CAI is a great resource for that. They also have a really good website that has a lot of free, everyone loves free stuff, free resources for both boards and managers to take a look at.
Do you represent associations or do you represent homeowners most often?
So we represent associations. Okay. We typically do not represent homeowners, but our client is the association and the board acts on behalf of that association.
So that would be a property manager that's acting on behalf of others to manage the board in that way. So
yes, a lot of our communication is with the property manager, but the property manager also is taking direction from the board. So there's certain situations where my main point of contact will be the property manager for some things like collections work or things like that. Usually it's just the board has instructed the property manager and I'm working with them to facilitate that. There's other situations where, say, for example, we were involved in a lawsuit on behalf of the association where my communications would directly be with the board and not the property manager to keep the attorney-client privilege.
Understood. And I'm curious, going back to the speaking engagements, one was titled here, Drama-Free HOA Meetings with Tips and Tricks for Rogue Behavior, Drama Queens, and Unexpected Guests. I got to know a little bit more about that.
I mean, well, if you've ever attended an association meeting where maybe something that is controversial is being voted on or discussed, it can get pretty interesting. It can get pretty heated. So I attend a lot of those. A lot of times they'll have me come and help run the meeting. And, there's some tips we like to give people for if you are trying to increase your assessments by 30%, people are going to be unhappy about that. But you know what? Let's get the information out and let's answer the questions and give people their time to speak because that's what they want and they should have that. And then let's sit down and try and keep it orderly and vote. So it's very difficult to do because, like I said, tempers flare. It's your biggest investment and people get very invested in it. So just trying to keep everybody calm is sometimes difficult, but there's never a dull moment.
Mm-hmm. So with regards to homeowners associations that may need to increase dues or imply an assessment to increase dues, how do you find the best way to have folks understand why that should be done and how the maintaining of the property may has been lacking for a certain period of time and we need to spend money to improve the property? How do you sell that to the homeowners?
I'm so glad you asked that. That is one of the hardest things for a board to do because it means a lot to these people. And a lot of people just don't have a bunch of money sitting around where they can write a check for either a special assessment or an increase in assessments. I really feel strongly that communication is the key. The more the board is upfront and open with their members about what they're looking to do and their options for proceeding with that plan of action, the easier I think it is to have something like that get approved by the members. I like when boards allow members to come to their meetings, at least a portion of the meetings. Some of the meeting has to be kept private. But I like when they allow members to come to the meetings and talk. I like when they have informational meetings with their members well in advance of a vote. The last thing I want is to show up at a special meeting where a vote is on to increase the assessments or to have a special assessment and have it be the first meeting where it's been discussed because it will not go well. The more they talk to their homeowners in advance, the easier it is. And quite frankly, we've had some homeowners give some excellent feedback that really none of us have thought of, but they gave feedback to the board in advance and the board changed their options or ideas based on that feedback. So I think that's very important.
What should an HOA do when local media do a story about a dispute? Should they speak up? I'm not talking about anyone that's currently ongoing. Yeah. Let's talk about the past. Maybe you've encountered that in the past.
So we get calls, our office gets calls a lot from the media when they hear of a story. And if the association's a client of ours, we're asked to comment. Typically, depending on the situation, the usual response is no comment. Because it really depends on what's going on. But usually there's no comment coming from either the attorney for the association or the board. I will usually tell my clients to communicate as they need to with their members, but that they should limit it to that.
Have you encountered many complaints from associations with regard to short-term rentals?
We dealt with one yesterday. So we probably see one a week. it is a big issue in Charlotte. Some of the governing documents will have a minimum term, like no less than 30 days. Some of the older ones don't speak about rentals at all. Mm-hmm. So in that case, they can do a short-term rental. But if they have restrictions about minimum term and they find that they do have owners that are trying to do some sort of short-term rental, they usually call us and we will work with the board and send letters to the owner advising them that it is a violation of their governing documents. If necessary, they might also be called to a hearing and possibly fined, or their community privileges can be revoked if they continue to proceed in violation of those covenants.
So with regard to those covenants that may restrict short-term rentals, do you ever see communities come together and want to revise those documents?
Absolutely. It's a lot of what we do. That's I consider it our general representation of associations, answering questions, giving opinion letters, drafting documents, and amending documents. So we've had quite a few communities in Charlotte, especially back when the Democratic National Convention was here quite a few years ago. They had a rash of people wanting to rent their unit just for the week or 2 weeks that the convention was here. But most of their governing documents prohibited rentals for less than 30 days. So how did they deal with that? And a lot of them amended their covenants in advance of that meeting to allow their members to rent for that one specific instance. But yes, we see amendments all the time with people wanting to either restrict the rentals, put a cap on them, maybe say no more than 20% of our community can be rentals, or they will do a 30-day minimum rental, or we even have some that say no rentals at all.
So I'm aware of a few communities that will not allow rentals at all. And what's interesting is in those communities, I've noticed that appreciation rates are very slow compared to other communities in and around the same area with regard to that restriction. What's your thought on that?
Sure. Yeah, no, I can completely understand that. I personally prefer some rentals. I think that some people will have a situation, either a family situation or a job situation that requires them to move, and they may or may not, depending on the market, be able to sell their property right away, and they may only have the option to rent for a little while. So I like it when associations do allow some rentals, because the difficulty is when there's no rentals, you have decreased your pool of potential buyers. And we advise that when we talk about their options for amending, but there's some that want to do it anyway. And that, to amend, to do that, the owners have to vote for it. So if the owners are on board, they can do it.
Absolutely.
I'm curious also, I've seen an increased trend of initial capital contribution fees, and then some what we call HOA exit fees, on the way out. I know it also depends on the way that was initially structured. Are you seeing a trend where there's more of that going on?
I'm not seeing more of it. I'm seeing pretty much they're operating the same. I don't see a whole lot of exit fees in the documents. The documents that I'm drafting now for our clients, I'm not really putting in an exit fee payable to the association. Most of them all do have a capital contribution for the first sale to the new owner. Most of them do that just to get that pot started. But it's not usually more than maybe $200 or so, $250, depending on the community. But it gives them some money to get started, so which is helpful for the association.
Cynthia, I've also noticed those capital contributions on new developments. But what's interesting, there are a couple in mind that I've seen where it had very low capital contribution, and then the dues were very low. And I'm wondering, is that a function of sellability for the developer, or because that, to the point you made earlier, it's important that they build enough reserves to maintain the private street, the brick wall surrounding the property, parking lot, what have you. So, and at what onus does the developer have to set realistic HOA dues?
They should be looking at all of that. And the developers I work with, we look at all of that. They have budgets. They know what they're planning for in the community with regards to amenities, maybe a clubhouse and a pool house and tennis courts, and what it's going to cost to maintain all of that. And they build that into their budget when they set their capital contribution and their initial assessment rate. And that usually works well. But when it's turned over from the developer to the association, when I'm helping an association with that turnover, my recommendation to the association is always for them to pay to have we call it a reserve study done of the community. And someone comes in, and there's professionals that do this regularly for associations, and they come in and they look at everything in the community, and they look at what they have in their bank account, and they look at what they're charging assessments for their owners on, and they help the association plan over the next 10, 20 years. These are your forecasted expenses. And with these forecasted expenses at this time, this is what your assessments should be. And that allows them, the association, to say, do we need to increase? Do we maybe need to decrease? I've not really seen a lot that need to decrease. Most of them need to increase a little bit so they can put more money in reserve. So when they're hit with that big expense of replacing the roof or resurfacing the pool, they don't have to do a special assessment. They can pull it from reserves.
Very good. So at what point is there a particular percentage where the developer can step back and not be involved in the HOA?
So it depends on what the governing documents say. Some developers will retain complete control of everything until they've sold every lot. Some have built in that they will turn over portions of control, or maybe a board seat or 2 board seats out of 5 when they've sold 60% of the lots. It basically just depends on what they've got in the documents when they're drafted. Most of them will start at least involving owners when they've sold a certain percentage to kind of help the turnover. And then once they've sold maybe 90%, they will let the board be controlled by the owners. Now, they might still retain some architectural control over their building for those remaining lots they have, but they'll let the members run it.
Certainly. With respect to your day-to-day and the market that we're in, are you more busy now than you were 5 or 6 years ago?
Yes. Well, I don't really think we ever slow down. And I consider that good job security, I suppose. But there's always, I do a lot. I run our collections department. I do a lot of amendments. I do a lot of opinion letters. I get asked something new every week. Something that I'm happy to answer it. I just never thought I'd be asked this. Some of it's really interesting that I've never thought of before. I had our summer associate in my office this morning before I came here, and he raised an issue, and I looked at him and I said, I've never thought of that. That's an interesting issue, but we're busy all the time. I mean, we slow down a little bit around the holidays, Christmas and New Year's, but other than that, we're very busy during the summer going to meetings. And then at the end of the year, everyone's ramping up for budget season, so they've got a lot of questions about that. But we don't seem to slow down much at all.
Very good. I can tell you, when we represent buyers that are considering purchasing into a condo development or a single-family development that has an HOA, we part of the process that we go through is to request from the homeowners association all of the financials and, of course, the covenants, restrictions, bylaws, what have you. Is there anything else that you would recommend that we ask for, and when we represent our buyers that buy into a home or a community where an HOA is present?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for asking for that information. I think that one of the problems we have is that that people aren't asking for that before they buy in, and then they're in an association after they've purchased, and they're subject to all these rules and restrictions, and they, quite frankly, I hear all the time, well, I didn't think I was in an HOA. I didn't know I had to do that. That's new to me. Why didn't anyone tell me? So thank you for asking for that information up front. That's exactly what you should be asking for. You should, before they're at the closing table with the attorney, I feel very strongly anybody buying into a community should sit down and read those restrictions that are on their property. They need to know what they can and can't do on their property, whether they have to cut their grass every 2 weeks, whether they can change the color of their house without approval, those kinds of things. They should be reading it. I know it's lengthy. It can put you to sleep sometimes, but if they don't read it before, they're still going to be subject to it after. But along the lines of financials, absolutely, you want to be able to see what kind of condition is the association in. to protect your buyers, you don't want them probably buying into a condo association that doesn't have any reserves and maybe the roof needs to be redone. You know as well as I do, they're probably going to have a special assessment in the next couple of years. And once your owner buys in there, they're subject to it as well. So
on the topic of identifying what someone is buying into through that due diligence process where we ask for the covenants, restrictions, bylaws, and financials, do you see folks that with regard to disclosing an assessment or pending assessment, that's pretty clear. But when it's just conversation and the seller feels like, well, it hasn't been necessarily proposed, but we are starting conversations, as an attorney, from a seller's perspective, wouldn't you expect that the seller would need and be required to provide that, hey, the topic came up. It hasn't been voted on, but it is in conversations.
Right. Yeah, I would like to. And as a buyer, I would want to know that personally. The problem comes in with, number one, they're worried that if they speak up and say something, they're going to lose the buyer. And, but if they don't speak up and say something, no one knows, because the buyer doesn't have the chance to go to those meetings and he's not seeing the notices from the association. So yeah, I would want to know if that was going on, just that it was being discussed. Now, I think I would feel a little more comfortable if I knew, okay, they have $300,000 in reserves. And yes, the seller did tell me they're talking about possibly redoing the roofs, and that's going to cost $250,000. Okay, we may not have to do a special assessment because we've got the money set aside for it. So I think it all works hand in hand to take a look at all of that. But I like it when people are more upfront. The last thing you want is someone buying a house and getting a call from me saying, you've got to pay $25,000.
Sure.
So with respect to dues collections, and we talked about reserve study, curious is there any dues study that if an HOA or a homeowners association is considering raising their dues, how do they come to that conclusion? Obviously, it's based on needs and what they're trying to achieve. But is there a study that goes hand in hand with raising dues and when that's needed? Can I just coattail on that real quick?
Absolutely.
I would be willing to bet that usually comes with a contractor or someone has called out a contractor to figure out what's going on, and then they're faced with an estimate that happens to be more than what they budgeted for from the previous year. But Cynthia, tell me what you think.
Right. Well, so the reserve study will be part of that.
Okay.
But the key also to that is a good manager. So the good manager is going to have the background to look at the financials from the beginning of the association forward and see what are the expenses, what is our income. There's caps in every association usually about how much the board can raise assessments each year without having a vote of the owners. Sometimes it's 10% from the previous year. So there's also restrictions there. But they should certainly be looking at, what are our proposed expenses. The reserve study does do some of that, but that's the only group that I know that will come through and look at and help them try and determine, are we collecting enough or not based on what we're going to have to do in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Once again, thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you so much.
For another episode of Charlotte Real Estate Talk, Mike Hagee, Scott Pridemore. Thank you so much.
Listen, download our podcast, or find out more about Charlotte Real Estate at pridemoreproperties.com.